everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am finally back to do the second installment in my Penguin Monarchs series, in which I go through and I read and talk about all of the different books that are listed in the Penguin Monarchs series. In the first video that I did way back in November, we covered the life of Æthelstan, who ruled England up until 939. And the Penguin Monarchs series does a little bit of a jump, because the next installment covers the life of Æthelred, or Æthelred the Unready as he's often known, who ruled England from 978 until 1016. With a little bit of a gap right near the end, and I will explain why later. There isn't really much of an explanation as to why Penguin chose to omit certain rulers. I'm guessing because a lot of these Anglo-Saxon kings ended up ruling just for a couple of years here and there, and also because of name recognition, maybe they just chose not to include them. And for all we know, there might be plans to include them later down the line. If that does happen, I will obviously update the playlist, squeeze in that review. But for now, today we are talking about Æthelred the Unready. As always, starting off this video by talking about what people at home might already know about this figure. I think the fact that Æthelred is rarely heard without the moniker the Unready at the end really says it all. The general perception of Æthelred, if people have heard of him at all, is that he was a bit of a failure of a monarch. And in fact, Richard Abels starts off his biography with quite a damning first line. Few English kings have had a worse popular reputation than Æthelred II the Unready. The reason being that the main thing that Æthelred is known for really is for losing his throne, losing England to the Vikings. When Æthelred is spoken about, he's often used in conjunction to his great-grandfather Alfred the Great, but this comparison is not flattering at all. As Abels succinctly writes, the latter as a symbol of English success and the former of failure. So that doesn't sound too promising, does it? In this installment of the Penguin Monarchs series, Richard Abels appears to actually want to break down this popular notion of Æthelred as a failure of the king. He seems to be making a concerted effort to kind of balance out the good and the bad aspects of his reign, admitting that there are some rather dire aspects, but also illuminating the good, and also talking about how a lot of the bad things that happened weren't necessarily Æthelred's fault, but the fault of issues outside of Æthelred's control. His first major order of business is really to dispel the name Æthelred the Unready. First things first, this nickname actually derives from the 12th century. It doesn't come from Æthelred's reign itself, and the name derives from a pun based on Æthelred's name. The Anglo-Saxon name Æthelred actually means noble council, and the Unready moniker that we have is actually a pun based on subverting that name, noble council. One of the major criticisms of Æthelred's reign is that he was poorly counselled, that he had bad advisors. Meanwhile, the word unread or unreared, tell me how to pronounce that, I don't know. I don't know Old English. This is the word that actually means folly or bad plan. You can kind of see 12th century chroniclers being like, Æthelred, more like unread, am I right? Over time, the similarity of unread to the word unready gradually led to people starting to think of Æthelred as somebody who was just unprepared, who was lazy, rather than what it actually meant, which was that he made foolish decisions or had bad counsel. It's literally a case that this pun is just so good that we kind of ignore the fact that it's not actually accurate to his reign. And if that's not reflective of internet culture at large, I don't know what is. Richard Abels also takes quite a bit of umbrage over the fact that so much focus is often put towards Æthelred's response to the Vikings and seeing that as a failure. He says that to only think of Æthelred in terms of Viking conquest is tantamount to historical tunnel vision, and that we need to spend time looking at the positive things of his reign, and that actually the successful aspects of his reign may have been what actually led the Vikings to see England as tantalizing, that because he did so well, it made England more attractive to the Vikings. Abels cites how Æthelred laid foundations for the English common law, the major ecclesiastical reform that took place in his reign. He also describes Æthelred's reign as a golden age of Anglo-Saxon art and literary production, and that far from being unready, Æthelred responded to the Viking invasion with energy, innovation and flexibility, if not always success. That it was nothing to do with Æthelred's response to the Vikings that led to his failure, but rather that it was more his court that was to blame, and the issues within his court really doomed his reign. Firstly, that England was not united during his reign as a result of warring aristocratic families, and two, that there were some very powerful enemies, and that had this not been the case, Æthelred would not be known as such a failure as we know him today. So Æthelred was born in 966, son of King Edgar, otherwise known as Edgar the Peaceful, and his mother Elfrida. Æthelred came to the throne in 978, around the age of 12, and under some quite distressing circumstances, that being the death of his half-brother, King Edward. Edward was actually killed on his way to visit Æthelred and Elfrida, and unfortunately his murderers were never brought to justice. Edward definitely had some enemies and his reign was very contentious, but the fact that he was murdered meant that after his death, his reign ended up being glorified and he was was viewed as a martyr, especially after some rather miraculous occurrences started happening around his tomb. Like I mentioned, his murderers were never brought to justice, and so the young Æthelred ended up being criticised for not trying to find and punish the killers of his brother. To make things even worse, contemporaries at the time accused Æthelred's supporters, or even his mother, of being guilty of the murder. This bad beginning left a very bitter taste in people's mouth about Æthelred's reign. As Abels describes, this martyrdom became the original sin of Æthelred's reign, with people coming to see Edward's murder as a sign of England's moral degeneracy. More than a year elapsed before Æthelred's coronation on the 4th of May 1979. May the 4th be with you, Æthelred! And this occurred in Kingston upon Thames. Though Abels is clear to point out that this gap should not be seen as indicative of instability for Æthelred, but that a gap of around a year would have been usual even then. And upon holy relics, Æthelred had to pronounce a threefold royal oath. As Abels writes, a king was to preserve the peace of the church and of his realm, to forbid theft and all unrighteous things to all orders, and to command justice and mercy in all judgments. And already it seems like he was already failing at that. As Æthelred would have been no more than 12 at the time of his coronation, a regency was headed up by his mother Elfrida, though it was also headed up by Ealdorman Elfhere of Mercia and Bishop Ethelwold of Winchester. Anglo-Saxon names are not my friend. In this time there was very little military action, and it was seen as a time of peace and order, especially considering how little is written about this time, and that's something definitely to keep in mind. Absence of sources can often be a positive sign rather than a negative one, that there's just not much to report. Also something to keep in mind is that we often chronicle the bad and not the good, and under this regency the reign saw the enrichment of the church as well as a lot of monastic reform. This time of regency was seen as a return to the politics of Æthelred's father, which is quite understandable considering that a lot of his advisors were advisors to his father. However, there was quite a big shift in 984 as Æthelred came of age, and also some of these advisors started to die. Around this time, Æthelred decided to take control of the royal government and declare his independence. As a result of this exercise of power, many of these former advisors fell from grace, and Æthelred set about rewarding people who had been loyal to him in his eyes. However, unfortunately, the youth of the king was very much exploited, and there were many people getting in his ear trying to get money and lands from him. Æthelred also used this time to target certain monasteries and laid waste to them, including Rochester in 986. Abels noting how a lot of the monasteries that he targeted tended to be connected to his old advisor, Bishop Ethelwold. Clearly there was a bit of bad blood there. It was also around this time that Æthelred married for the first time to an unconfirmed wife who is thought to have been called Elfgifu. By this first wife he ended up having 6 sons and 2 daughters, all with Anglo-Saxon names that start with E, and I'm not going into it. However, after this regency of peace and order, in Æthelred's majority a new threat emerged. The Vikings. This new threat saw his father's old fleet being targeted, and in 980 Southampton was sacked by a fleet of 7 Viking ships. They also attacked Thanet and then moved over to Portland in 982. Things really started to take a turn for the worst in 991 when they landed in Folkestone in Kent. They then turned over to Essex, which is when a legendary battle took place. As they moved over to Essex, they were confronted by a fleet led by Ealdorman Berthnoth. Oh my god, how do I say that? Berthnoth headed up the king's troops, and they clashed at the Battle of Maldon. Abels notes that there was no numerical reason that England should have been defeated at this, but to the shock and terror of the English, Ealdorman Berthnoth was killed. It cannot be overstated how shocking this was. As Abels writes, no ealdorman had fallen in battle in living memory. No English army had suffered defeat on the battlefield in 4 decades. This loss really exposed the military vulnerability of England, which could be exploited further down the line. And a large part of the reason for this loss was that military systems from King Alfred's day had really been neglected. Things had been so secure and stable up until that point that England was really unprepared for an attack of that scale. And this was really the start of a big back and forth between the Vikings and Æthelred. The Vikings attacking, Æthelred offering them a bunch of money to try and stay away, and then them coming back again. After the Battle of Maldon, he offered them £10,000, buying time to try and build up his military again. There was also a plan to try and trap the Vikings outside of London, but this failed spectacularly. And it's also worth noting how Æthelred was often not leading the charges himself. He repeatedly delegated command to others. He would lead his military only 3 times, in the year 1000, in 1009, and in 1014. And he was really strongly criticised as a coward for this. He was just not the warrior king that people would have expected. However, once again, it cannot be overstated how important the presence of a monarch is for battle, both in terms of boosting morale, but also setting an example for troops of how to behave. And Æthelred was really failing in showing this example. Like I say, between 991 and 994, there was a continual back and forth between appeasement to the Vikings and fighting. And if we thought that I couldn't say Anglo-Saxon names, Viking names are going to be even harder for me, so give me a second. The main adversaries being Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who were themselves fighting against each other for who was going to control either area. So were really quite unlikely allies against the English. But they did join together to initially attack England in September 993. And once again, Æthelred responded by throwing money at the problem, giving them £16,000. He particularly targeted Tryggvason, who had recently converted to Christianity, and he offered to be his godfather. Because, you know, nothing says good bros like standing at someone's confirmation as their sponsor. Never hear about guys doing that for each other today. And this was quite a good plan, because not only did it rid Æthelred of Olaf's invasion, but it also kind of threw a spanner in the works between the allyship between Olaf and Sweyn Forkbeard, as support from the English incentivized Olaf to push his claim to rule Norway. Æthelred was able to break apart and cause conflict between these two Viking rulers. You know, he wasn't completely inept at political maneuvering. However, despite this little bit of a reprieve, this was not to be the end of Viking invasion. It was really quite a domino effect. Once one started, others were going to also be allured. And the southern coast of England was really hit hard. The chronicles that Richard Abels refers to really criticise Æthelred for wasting time, though Abels does point out that as a result of Æthelred's work, he did buy peace for a little bit of time, and in the year 1000, he was able to launch a sea campaign against Strathclyde and the Isle of Man in order to take those areas under his control. But once again, the Vikings returned, this time to Hampshire, Devonshire and the Isle of Wight. Æthelred paid them tribute, £24,000 this time. Do you notice how it's just building and building and building up? However, after this attack, he did agree to a marriage alliance, marrying the sister of the Duke of Normandy, whose father had been a big supporter of the Vikings. And we won't delve into much about her today, but Emma of Normandy was such a fascinating figure in her own right. Arguably, I would say she's more interesting than Æthelred himself. Definitely, if you have a chance, look her up. At this point, Æthelred's first wife had died, so he was definitely in the market for another wife. And he did end up having more children by Emma. However, in 1002, Æthelred was told about a plot by the Danish to kill him and his counsellors, and Æthelred responded with what Richard Abels describes as the darkest stain of his posthumous reputation, the St. Brice's Day massacre. Æthelred ordered that all the Danish men who were among the English race be killed on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November. And this was a truly grisly, horrifying day, with defenceless men, women and children being put to the sword. Not deterred by this, however, Sweyn Forkbeard resumed raiding the next year, which led to the sacking and burning of Norwich. Once again, going back to Richard Abels' depiction of Æthelred, he does try to balance out these not so good aspects with the good, particularly noting Æthelred's willingness to learn from past mistakes, noting how in 1993 he confirmed privileges on Abingdon Abbey, coming to regret his past actions to try and install his own abbot of choice and halting the free elections that would usually take place. He also notes that the coinage that was produced during Æthelred's reign is a real sign of the effectiveness of his government, as well as the surplus of wealth of the country, which definitely would have made England a more attractive target to the Vikings, and also the coinage as a demonstration of how he was able to unite the four kingdoms, which at this point were Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria and the Danelaw. Æthelred also issued 6 law codes over the course of his reign, which, you know, is a good number, is a definite demonstration of his good kingship. However, a not so good sign of his kingship was that he was really unwilling to delegate power, and large swathes of England were left without an ealdorman, which I guess you could kind of equate to a lord. He seemed to prefer for these areas to answer directly to him rather than to an ealdorman. There was also a veritable outpouring of theological and political writing in this time, particularly as a result of religious reform. Once again, I'm going to have to really look at these names, including Berthfirth's Life of Dunstan. I'm definitely going to put the names on the screen. Wulfstan the Cantor and his Lives of St. Æthelwold, as well as Ælfric's 40 Catholic homilies. You know, you've got to enjoy a monarch who inspires good writing. Though it has to be said that not all of this writing was complementary to Æthelred's reign. Ælfric's work particularly demonstrated frustration with Æthelred's failure to deal with the Viking threat effectively. And Wulfstan wrote about the Vikings as a scourge sent by God, harbingers of the end times. We can see from writing that Æthelred and his advisors were really not hitting the spot in terms of what was expected of a monarch, in terms of his capability in protecting his land and dispensing with justice, an echo of criticisms that he had at the beginning of his reign with dealing with his brother's killers. And then once again, starting in 1006, the Viking invasions were really pushed to breaking point. They arrived in Sandwich in Kent and really started pillaging, pushing past the English armies right through to Hampshire and Berkshire, which led to another spectacular defeat for the English. Once again, Æthelred paid out for more peace, this time at the tune of £36,000. Once again, Æthelred pulled back, tried to build up his defences, but this was not enough to sustain sustain against these attacks. In 1009, Æthelred sent his fleet out to sandwich against the Vikings, but once again, this was foiled. This time after some of his men ended up deflecting to the Vikings. After this attempt, Æthelred ended up fleeing back to London. And so the Vikings just kept coming, and it started to leave people wondering, why is this happening? Is this a punishment from God? And if so, England has to work out how to do right by God and what actions to take next. Æthelred's initial response to this was to demonstrate his piety through what Abels describes as an impressive program for national repentance, prayer and almsgiving. He issued the Enham Code, which exhorts his people to love and honour one God, zealously observe one Christian faith, and to confirm by word and by pledge our firm intention of observing one Christian faith under the authority of one king. Let us loyally support one royal lord, and all of us together defend our lives and our country to the best of our ability, and from our inmost heart pray to God Almighty for help, as well as a variety of suggestions of how we can implement that. As Abels writes, these deal with a variety of topics including currency, weights and measures, repair of fortifications and bridges, fulfilling military service that was owed, preparation of the fleet so that the ships would soon be ready after Easter, desertions from the army, plots against the king, injuries to nuns and widows, and generally the suppression of injustice in matters both religious and secular. But as you can imagine, all these words were not really that effective against the true physical threat that was the Vikings. In 1010, East Anglia and Wessex were really ravaged by the Vikings once again, this time led by the Viking Thorkel. He eventually captured Canterbury as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered not very nicely. Is there a nice way to murder somebody? I don't think so. But allegedly he ended up meeting his death by being pelted by cow bones, before one Viking eventually got bored and just struck him on the head with his axe. Once again, Æthelred tried to pay off Thorkel, rising up once again to the price of £48,000, with the justification that it would be better for Thorkel to work with him rather than against him. However, this partnership prompted Sweyn Forkbeard back to England, and in 1013 he brought a large naval force to England, no longer just to raid but now to conquer. He started in Northumbria and went down towards the Danelaw, then to Oxford, Winchester and Bath, quickly taking over. London eluded him for a little while. Æthelred was a powerful motivator for people to stay by him. However, London's isolation became too much for the people, and eventually was enough to convince them to submit to Sweyn Forkbeard. Æthelred tried to hold on for a little bit longer, but eventually he did end up fleeing to Normandy. And we see through this how Æthelred was usurped. Sweyn became the king of England and Denmark. However, unfortunately for Sweyn Forkbeard, this was not to last. His reign was very brief and he died only 3 months later. However, the Witan, or the High King's Council as it was known, was not happy with this arrangement, and they ended up recalling Æthelred back to the throne of England. For whatever reason, they seemed to prefer Æthelred over Canute, and Æthelred was restored to his throne in 1014, quickly declaring every Danish king an outlaw in England. Canute ended up escaping over to Denmark, and Æthelred decided to take his vengeance out on any people who turned against him. Canute was not to stay away for too long, and he did return in 1015, hitting the south of England with his own fleet. At this point, Æthelred's son decided to take up arms and rose an army up in the north of England, bringing it down to confront Canute. By this point, I think it's fair to say that Æthelred was a little bit sick of all this, once again demonstrating his unwillingness to take the field, and his son had to try to fill that vacuum of power. But once again, we are seeing how the presence of the king, or the absence of the king, really affects morale, and Edmund's army ended up quickly disintegrating. In the midst of fighting against Canute, Æthelred's health was really starting to fail, and as Canute entered London, Æthelred died. And on the 23rd of April, 1016, Æthelred was buried in the church of St. Paul the Apostle. So at the end of all of this, what really was Æthelred's legacy? After his death, his son Edmund Ironside did try to take the throne of England, and did rule as king for a few months. However, after having another run-in with Canute, he ended up conceding part of England to him. However, Edmund and Canute did apparently seem to have quite a respect for one another, and it was basically agreed that whichever one of them died first, the other would end up taking their portion of England. Unfortunately, Edmund was the one who died first. In fact, he died like 3 months after taking the throne, and so Canute ended up being king of England. I guess it is notable to say that Æthelred was actually the longest ruling Anglo-Saxon king at 38 years on the throne. Granted, part of that is because he was a child king, but you know, still did quite a good job. Well done, you stayed alive. Something that this book doesn't really pick up upon as a legacy of Æthelred is the fact that it is not just Edmund who becomes a king of England. In fact, Æthelred has another son by his second wife Emma, who does go on to be quite a famous figure, quite a famous monarch of English history, Edward the Confessor. And I don't know, I just think it's quite interesting that that's not mentioned here. But really, the largest lasting legacy of Æthelred is the fact that under his rule, England was invaded for the first time since the Romans. Because yes, for a bit of time there, the Vikings did take over and rule England. So what is it that we can learn from Æthelred's reign? Both about monarchs, but also something that we can apply to our own life. One thing that Richard Abels wants us to take away from this from the get-go is that historians are by nature revisionists. That it's really important to remember that history is not set in stone. History is something that is continually being reworked and reanalyzed through different lenses. People often think of history as being this list of dates and facts and figures that we have to memorize, but that is far from the case. Part of the lasting legacy of Æthelred as Æthelred the Unready comes from the 12th century, but yet today we are starting to re-examine how we look at him. You can't just take one source for granted. You have to constantly be digging up, trying to find new information and interrogating the facts that you think that you know. And that's not just something that is important for our understanding of history, it's also something that we can take into our own lives, especially looking at the news today. Another thing to bear in mind when we're looking at Æthelred is that rulers should not be boiled down to just one event or one aspect of their reign. And also I would say that reducing people down to nicknames is kind of a bad thing to do. People are more than just nicknames that society and history have given down to them. So why is it that we do that? And I guess it's the fact that people often like to work in very black and white terms, and we as society like to reduce people down to one aspect and not look at people complexly, because having to do that means that you have to confront their humanity. I think if you take anything from this, it's that you should look at your fellow human beings as the complex humans and individuals that they are. Don't just look at people in a very black and white way. Something that you can take from the beginning of Æthelred's reign and the way that he came to the throne is that martyrdom can be quite a thorn in a reign's side. Martyrdom can make heroes of people who had previously been despised, and that's something that you'll come to later with Henry II. And that kind of thing can really haunt a reign. Something that's also going to echo down with further kings is that boy kings, even if they grow up, are often seen in terms of their boyhood. A couple of things that make me think of Game of Thrones quite a lot is the importance of personality of a monarch and also the presence of a monarch, particularly in battle. Kind of think about Joffrey in the Battle of the Blackwater, how his presence inspires the troops and then when he leaves they end up being quite dejected. Another bit of a Game of Thrones analogy is that advisors really do make a king. As Tywin Lannister says, a good king knows what he knows and what he doesn't. And having good advisors can really make or break a monarch, as we see with Æthelred's reign. And then the final thing that I think we can take from Æthelred the Unready's life is that you should never take safety for granted. Because there was such a long stretch of time of peace, this meant that under Æthelred's reign, England was very ill prepared for attacks because they kind of took the fact that peace was going to be there. And then the Vikings came over and they proved that that was not the case. So now that we've done looking at this book, where else can you go to learn more about Æthelred the Unready's life and the society that he reigned over? To be honest, after doing my own research, I couldn't find that many things on him. Very helpfully though, the Rex Factor podcast, who I am a big fan of, actually dedicated 2 episodes to the reign of Æthelred. One when they first started doing the podcast, and then another one 10 years later, kind of revising their opinion of him with new information that came to light. Once again, going to show that history is not set in stone. I know that Levi Roach also has a great biography, which I would definitely like to check out. If you're wanting to look directly at contemporary primary sources, then the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is definitely the place to go. And then, as is my want, I always want to look at the women of this time period. Queen's podcast have a fantastic episode on Emma of Normandy, who was Æthelred's second wife, and she just appears like such a fascinating figure. There's also a biography by Harriet O'Brien called Queen Emma and the Vikings. Also, Elizabeth Norton published a biography on Elfrida, or Elfrida as I think we know her from this book, who was Æthelred's mother, which I'd really like to check out. And so that was everything for Æthelred the Unready. I'd be really curious to know what your perceptions of Æthelred were before. Did you know anything about him? Do you have anything else that you think I should have talked about today? Next up, we'll be talking about Canute the North Sea King by Ryan Lavelle. And I am quite excited to read this and learn more about the Vikings, because I'm not really a big Viking girl, and just generally really excited to get back to this series. And so that's everything for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.